Chapter 23. The Leacht-Con-Mic-Ruis. We wanted to drive around Lough Gill, a distance of about 25 miles, and I'd mentioned this project to our landlord the day before, and asked the price of a car. He said it was a long trip, and a trying one on a horse, and that the price would be 20 shillings, and I saw the same glitter in his eye, which had been there when he named the price of a room. That afternoon, I happened to see a sign over a shop, announcing that posting was done in all its branches. Remembering the glitter in the landlord's eye, I stopped in and asked the woman in charge if a car could be had for the trip around Lough Gill. She said it might, and the price would be 12 shillings, including the driver. I closed with her on the spot, and told her to have the car ready at 9 o'clock next morning. And somewhat to my surprise, it was. And we set forth on what was to prove one of the most beautiful and adventurous excursions we had had in Ireland. It was a bright, warm day, and our Jarvey, a picturesque old fellow, was quite certain it would not rain. But we put our raincoats and all our other waterproof paraphernalia in the well of the car, so as to be prepared for the worst. And we elected to go out by the northern shore and come back by the southern one. For a mile or two, our road lay through beautiful, fragrant woods, and then we came out high above the lake. There is no prettier lake in Ireland than Lough Gill, with its green islands, and its blue water reflecting the blue sky and the fleecy clouds, and its banks covered with a vegetation almost as varied and luxuriant as that about Killarney, and the purple mountains crowding down upon it. Only, it is hardly fair to call them purple, for they are of many colours. The grey granite of their towering escarpments gleaming in the sun, the wide stretches of heather just showing a flush of lavender, the clumps of dark woodland clothing the glens, the broad spread of green pastures along their lower slopes, all combining in a picture not soon forgotten. For 2 or 3 miles we trotted on with this fairy scene stretched before us, and then we turned back into the hills, for we wanted to see the Leacht-Con-Mic-Ruis, the stone of Con the son of Rush, set up on a neighbouring hilltop as a warning and a sign. At least, Murray calls it the Leacht-Con-Mic-Ruis, but our driver had never heard of it, though he protested that he knew every foot of the neighbourhood. Perhaps he did not recognise the words as I pronounced them, and, as he could not read, it did no good for me to show them to him in the book. So I described it to him as well as I was able, never having seen it myself, and having only the vaguest idea what it looked like, as a collection of great standing stones on top of a hill not far away. And still he had never heard of it. He was inclined to turn back to the lake, but I persisted. And finally he stopped a man who was driving a cart into Sligo, and they talked together a while in Irish. And then our driver turned up another road, not very hopefully. It was a very hilly road, and our horse developed an alarming propensity to gallop, a propensity which the driver encouraged rather than strove to check, so that we felt, a good part of the time, as though we were riding to a fire at breakneck speed. The jaunting car, it should be remembered, is a 2-wheeled vehicle, and when the animal between the shafts takes it into his head to gallop, it describes violent arcs through the air. But we hung grimly on, and finally our driver drew up at a house near the roadside. "'Tis here," he said. We got down and looked around, but saw nothing that resembled the Leacht-Con-Mic-Ruis. And then a woman came out of the house, and we asked her if she knew where it was, and, wonder of wonders, she did. Most wonderful of all, she had been to see it herself, so she knew where it was not vaguely, but precisely, and she told us just how to go. It was on the hill back of the house, and she showed us the path which we must follow, and told us to look out for the rabbit warrens, or we might sprain an ankle. And we set off through knee-deep heather up over the hill. It was quite a climb, and when we got to the top we saw no standing stones, and I wondered if we were going to miss them after all. But we pressed on, and then, as we topped the next rise, my heart gave a leap, for there before us was the Leacht-Con-Mic-Ruis, the most remarkable stone enclosure I have seen anywhere, with the exception of Stonehenge, and Stonehenge is more remarkable only because its stones are larger. In every other way, in extent and in complexity, this enclosure far outranks Stonehenge. Great upright rocks, lichened and weather-beaten by the rains and winds of 40 centuries, form a rude oblong, about 150 feet in length by 50 feet across. It stretches east and west, and at the western end is a square projection like a vestibule, divided into 2 chambers, while at the eastern end are 2 smaller oblongs some 10 or 12 feet square, and their doorways are 2 trilithons, that is to say, 2 great rocks set on end with another rock laid across them, just as at Stonehenge. I despair of trying to picture it in words, but I took 2 photographs, one of which is opposite the preceding page, and gives some idea of the appearance of this remarkable monument, at least of the trilithons. But it gives no idea of its shape or its extent. There was no vantage point from which I could get a photograph that would do that. Its effect, here on this bleak hilltop, with other bleak hills all around as far as the eye could see, was tremendously impressive. Nobody knows who built it, nor when it was built, nor why. That it was a shrine of some sort, a holy place, seems evident. And to me, it seemed also evident that the Holy of Holies were those 2 little chambers back of the trilithic doorways. And it seemed to me also significant that they should be at the east end, nearest the sunrise, just as the altars in Gothic churches are, and that there should be a vestibule or entrance at the west end. Surely it was built with some reference to the sun. And I tried to picture the horde of panting men who had, with incredible labour, hacked out these giant stones from some quarry now unknown, and pulled them up the steep hillside, and somehow manoeuvred them into place. Some powerful motive must have actuated them, and I can think of none powerful enough except the motive of religion. The motive of building a great temple to the god they worshipped, in the hope of pleasing him and winning his favour. What strange rites, I wondered, had these old stones witnessed? What pageantries? What sacrifices? What incantations? Of all that ancient people, there remains on earth not a single trace, except in such silent monuments of stone as this. So mighty the passing centuries have been powerless to destroy them, more mysterious, more inscrutable than the Sphinx. We tore ourselves away at last, and went silently down through the heather, which was fairly swarming with rabbits, and we mounted our car and headed back toward the lake. We came out presently close beside the shore, and followed it around its upper end. Just there, out at the end of a point of land, stands the fragment of a tower, and our Jarvey told us it was all that was left of the castle from which Dervla eloped with Dermot McMurrough, a tale already told by the little tailor of Limerick. Of course, I wanted a picture of it, and, after much manoeuvring, I managed to get the one opposite this page, which I include only because of the beautiful Japanesey branch across one corner, for this wasn't Breffni's castle at all, as we were presently to find. A little farther on, and quite near the road, was another ruin, and a most imposing one, with drum towers at the 4 corners, and a dilapidated cottage hugging its wall. And I took a peep within the square enclosure, used now as a kind of barnyard. There were little turrets looking out over the lake, and a spiral stair in one corner, and mullioned windows and tall chimneys and yawning fireplaces. And it looked a most important place, but I've not been able to discover anything of its history. Then we went on again, with beautiful views of the lake at our right, and high on our left the flat-topped mountain called O'Rourke's Table, where, once upon a time, as told by the old ballad, O'Rourke's noble feast was spread. O'Rourke's noble fare will ne'er be forgot by those who were there, or those who were not. His revels to keep, we sup and we dine, on 70 sheep, fat bullocks, and swine. And so on. It is, indeed, a table fit for such a celebration. A rock plateau with sheer escarpments of grey granite dropping away from it, and a close cover of purple heather for a cloth. The road curved on along the lake, then turned away from it through a beautiful ravine. And then a sparkling river was dashing along at our right, and beyond it loomed the grey walls of a most extensive ruin. And then we dropped steeply down into the town of Dromahair, and stopped at a pretty inn to bait the horse. I wanted to get closer to the ruins, and I asked if there was a bridge across the river, and was told that there was, just behind the hotel. So I made my way down to it, to find that the bridge was a slender plank, without handrail or guard, spanning some ugly-looking rapids. I looked at the plank, and I looked at the swirling water, and I looked at the grey ruins on the farther shore, and I hesitated for a long time. But I wasn't equal to it, and I turned away at last, and made my way back to the village, in the hope of finding some more stable bridge there. The dominating feature of the village is not the workhouse or lunatic asylum, but an enormous mill, 5 stories high, built of black stone as hard as flint, to endure for all eternity, but forlorn and deserted. And while I was gazing at it, and wondering where the money had come from to build it, a man came out of the house attached to it and spoke to me. He was an Englishman, he said, who was spending his vacation at Dromahair. I asked him if there was any other bridge across the river except the slender plank, and he said that there was not, and that it was characteristic of the Irish that there should not be, for a more careless, shiftless, happy-go-lucky race did not exist anywhere on earth. I asked him about the mill, and he said that it was just another example of Irish inefficiency and wrong-headedness, that it had been erected at great expense, and equipped with the most costly machinery to grind American grain, which was to be brought up Sligo Bay from the sea, and up the river and across the lake. And then, when all was ready, there was no grain to grind, or none at least which could be brought to the mill without prohibitive expense. Furthermore, the power was so poor and costly that it would have been impossible to operate the mill profitably, even if there had been plenty of grain. But the owner of the mill, with some sort of dim faith in the power of home rule to produce the grain, was preparing to install a turbine to run the machinery, and had already started to build a big aqueduct to bring the water in from above the rapids. The rapids are just above the mill, and are quite imposing, and there, just beyond them, is the abbey. I was near enough to see it fairly well, though not, of course, in detail as I should have liked to do, but I comforted myself with the thought that it is a comparatively modern one, dating from the 16th century, when Margaret, the wife of another O'Rourke, having perhaps, like Dervla, done something she regretted, built it for the Franciscans. I had another comfort too, for I asked the Englishman if he had seen the Leacht-Con-Mic-Ruis, and he said that he had been hunting for it for a week, but hadn't been able to find it, as none of the people thereabouts seemed to know where it was. And he was astonished when I told him that we had found it, and commented with envy upon the energy of Americans. He asked me where it was, and I told him as nearly as I could, and then he wanted me to come in and have tea, and was for sending up to the hotel for Betty. But I had to decline that invitation. I think he was lonely and glad to find someone to talk to, for he was unusually expansive for an Englishman. And he said that he would send his car into Sligo for us, if we would come out next day. But I told him we were going on to Bundoran. And then I left him and went back up the hill to the ivy-covered ruin, which was really the castle of Tiernan O'Rourke. It stands on the edge of the hill overlooking the valley, the same valley which lay smiling before him that evening he came back from his pilgrimage to Loch Derg. And up there was the battlement from which no light burned. It was battered down in the 16th century in some obscure fight, and all that is left of the castle now is the shell of its walls. I am afraid Tom Moore, as well as O'Connell, journeyman tailor, has invested the story with a glamour which did not belong to it. For Tiernan O'Rourke was a one-eyed bandit who had sacked the Abbey of Clonard a few years before, and who certainly had need of pilgrimages to shrive him from his sins. And Dervla, so far from being a young false one, was 42 years old. And MacMurrough took care to carry off not only the lady's person, but all her movable property, and most of her husband's as well. The clouds were gathering in the west as we set out from Dromahair, and presently the rain began to slant down, slowly and softly at first, and then in a regular torrent. I do not know when I have seen it rain harder. But we were soon fixed for it, and didn't mind. Dromahair is about 12 miles from Sligo, and they are hilly miles, so we knew that we had at least 3 hours of this wet work ahead of us. But the people working in the fields or plodding along the road paid no attention to the rain, so why should we? In fact, Most of them, though without any sort of protection, seemed to be quite unconscious that it was raining at all. And then, just when the rain was hardest, I saw to the left a circle of stones crowning a little hill, and I knew it was a cashel. A cashel, as I have explained already, is a fort made of stones, just as a rath is a fort made of earth, both being in the form of a circle. And I knew I could get pictures of raths without much difficulty, but I didn't know when I would see another cashel. So I made the driver stop and got my camera out of the well, and started off through a field to get a picture of this one, not heeding Betty's anxious inquiry if I had suddenly gone mad. That field into which I plunged was thigh-deep with dripping grass, and I didn't realise how wet it was until I was well into it, and then there was nothing to do but go on. So I scrambled up the hill and took 2 pictures, shielding my lens as well as I could against the driving rain. And I hadn't any idea that the pictures would be good ones, but they were, and one of them is opposite the next page. There was no vantage point from which I could take a picture which would show the circular shape of the cashel, but it had been built in a perfect circle about 60 feet in diameter. It was on top of a steep hillock, of which it occupied nearly the whole summit. The walls, pierced only by a single narrow entrance, were about 6 feet high, and 4 or 5 feet thick, and the lower stones were very massive, as the picture shows. They had been roughly dressed and laid without mortar. The ancient Irish knew nothing of mortar apparently, for all these old stone circles are uncemented. But they had been so nicely fitted that they were still in place after many centuries, though the clambering ivy was doing its best to pull them down. Right in the middle of the circle was a great stone slab, flush with the ground. The only use I could imagine for it was as a base for a shrine or altar. But as I went down the road again, an old man came out of a little house to talk, and he said that some antiquarians from Sligo, who believed the slab covered the entrance to a secret passage, had taken it up and found beneath it, not a passage, but a beautifully fitted pavement. And that the parish priest, investigating on his own account, had dug up some wood ashes, and so decided that this was the place where the fire was built. But no one knows, my informant rambled on. Maybe someday some wise man like yourself will be able to tell us what it was for. I remarked that the man who did so would have to be far wiser than I. But he protested that he knew a wise man when he saw one, and I suspect that there is a Blarney stone in some of these ruins, which the general public doesn't know about. I was sorry it was raining, for there was another cashel on a hill to the right, and a great rath a little farther off, and I should have liked to explore both of them. But really the weather was too bad, so I went back reluctantly to the car, which our Jarvey had driven close under a clump of trees for shelter, and we were soon jogging contentedly on again. The valley which slopes down here to Lough Gill seems very fertile, and the little farms have a more prosperous look than is usual in Ireland. This is partly due to the fact that a number of neat labourers' cottages have been built to replace the usual tumble-down hovels, and still more are going up. This erection of labourers' cottages, which is going on today all over Ireland, seems to me almost as important as land purchase. If there is any class of Irish more deserving of pity than another, it is the agricultural labourer. He is worse off than the tenants. He has no land, however poor, to cultivate, except perhaps a tiny patch in front of his door. He has no means of livelihood except the unskilled labour of his hands. If he can manage to earn 10 shillings a week, he is unusually fortunate. In most cases, his average income throughout the year will be scarcely half that. So, naturally, the labourers and their families live in the most wretched of all the wretched hovels, in want, discomfort, and peril of disease. It is for the relief of these unfortunate people that the new houses are being built. They are very plain, but they have large windows which can be opened, and stone floors which can be cleaned, and tight slate roofs, and sanitary outbuildings. And each of them has a half-acre or so of garden, where vegetables enough to support the family can be raised during the summer. And they rent from 2 to 3 shillings a week, just enough to pay interest on the amount invested in the house, with a small sinking fund for upkeep and repairs. The money needed is borrowed from the government by the county council, and the council has control of the houses, decides where they shall be built, what rent shall be asked for them, and exercises a general supervision over the tenants. The same thing is being done in the towns, where the insanitary dwellings of the poorer artisans are being replaced by comfortable houses, rented at a very low rate. Nearly 100,000 of these cottages have been built within the past 10 years, replacing as many insanitary shacks, which, for the most part, have been torn down. The shacks were much more picturesque, but nobody regrets them. And the severely utilitarian aspect of the new dwellings will no doubt soon be masked with vines and climbing roses. It was such cottages as this, then, that gave the valley sloping down to Lough Gill an unusually prosperous appearance, and many more were in course of erection throughout the neighbourhood. We padded past them, along the road above the lake, between beautiful hedgerows, gay with climbing roses. And then we turned away through a luxuriant wood, where the bracken was almost waist high, and the trees were draped with moss and ferns, just as we had seen them along the southern coast. And then we passed through a gate, and jolted down a very rough and narrow lane. And finally our driver stopped at the edge of a wood, and pointed to a path running away under the trees. "'Tis the path to St. Patrick's Holy Well," he said, and we clambered down, and made our way under the trees and up the hillside, and there, before us, was the well. It is a lively spring, which bubbles up from the ground in considerable volume, fills a deep basin, and then sparkles away down into the valley. A wall has been built around it, with an opening on one side, and steps by which one may descend and drink of the magic water. Just above it on the hillside is a shrine, something like the one we had seen at St. Sennan's Well, really an altar where, I suppose, Mass may be celebrated. And it was crowded with figurines of the Virgin, and small crucifixes and rosaries and sacred pictures. And the bushes all about were tied with rags and strings, and other tokens, which the pilgrims to the shrine had left behind. This well is a very famous one, and the number of pilgrims who come to it prove how general is the belief in its powers. It is really a belief in the power of prayer, for prayer is always necessary. I tried to get a picture of the well and the shrine above it, but it was very dark under the trees, and there was no place where I could rest my camera for a time exposure. But the photograph opposite is better than I had any reason to expect. We found that the rain had ceased when we came out from under the trees, and we jogged happily back to the high road and on towards Sligo. And presently, far ahead, the bay opened out, rimmed by romantic hills, green nearly to the summit, and then culminating in the steep escarpments of grey rock. And beneath us in the valley lay the roofs and spires of the town, and we were soon rattling through its streets. We went back to the hotel to change out of our wet things, and to get a cup of hot chocolate. And then we took a last stroll about the streets, and stopped to see the Church of St. John, said to be older than the Abbey, but recently restored, and now used by a Church of Ireland congregation. The graveyard about it is full of interesting tombs, and the street it fronts is one of the most romantic in the town. Indeed, the whole town is interesting, its greatest drawback for the visitor being the beggars who infest it, and who are nearly as pertinacious as those at Killarney. We went back to the hotel at last, and told the proprietor that we were going to Bundoran by the 4 o'clock train. "You will make a great mistake," he protested, "to leave Sligo without going around Lough Gill." It was then I had my revenge. "We have been around Lough Gill," I explained sweetly. "That's where we were this morning." It is no easy task to travel along the west coast of Ireland. The great bays which indent it, running far inland, and the mountain ranges which tower one behind the other, make it impossible to follow anything like a straight line. The only thing to do is to zigzag around them. Our journey that afternoon was a striking example of this. Bundoran lies 22 miles north along the coast from Sligo, but to get there by rail, it was necessary to travel 92. 48 miles northeastward to Enniskillen, and then 44 miles westward to the coast again. The road to Enniskillen parallels Lough Gill, though it is so hemmed in by hills that we caught no glimpse of the water, and then proceeds across a dreary bog, climbing up and up with a wide valley opening to the south, and then runs into woodland and even orchards, the first, I think, that we had seen in Ireland, and then drops down toward Enniskillen, whose name lives in English history as that of one of the most famous of its regiments. It is said to be a pretty town, nestling between two lakes and entirely water-girt, but we did not stop to see it. We changed instead to the Bundoran line, which runs along the northern shore of Lough Erne, and we found the train crowded with people on their way to spend the weekend at that famous resort. At least, so we supposed, but when we got to Pettigo, there was a crowd on the platform, waving flags and shouting, and as the train stopped, somebody set off a series of bombs, and most of the passengers piled out of the train to take part in the celebration. And then we saw a man and woman standing rather sheepishly in front of another man, who was evidently delivering an address of welcome. We asked the guard what it was all about, and he said that the citizens of Pettigo were welcoming home a fellow townsman who had gone to Australia and won a fortune, and also a wife, or perhaps I should put it the other way around, and had come back to Pettigo to live. I was half inclined to get off there myself, in order to visit St. Patrick's Purgatory, a famous place of pilgrimage on an island in Lough Derg, 5 miles away. But, from the map, it looked as though it would be possible to drive over from Donegal, which would be much more convenient. I found out afterwards that there is a mountain range between Donegal and Lough Derg, and no direct road over it. So we did not get to visit the island where, so legend says, St. Patrick had a vision of purgatory, and which became so celebrated that pilgrims flocked to it from all over Europe. The time prescribed for the ceremonies is from the 1st of June to the middle of August, and the island is often so crowded with penitents performing the rounds that visitors are not permitted to land. Our train moved on after the address of welcome was concluded, and we could see the blue waters of Lough Erne stretching away to the south, while westward the sun was setting in a glory of crimson clouds. And presently the broad estuary of the Erne opened below us, hemmed in with high banks of yellow sand. And then we were at Bundoran, a bathing resort consisting of a single street of boarding houses facing the sea, and a little farther on a great hotel built on a projecting point of the cliffs. As we paused at its door to look about us, we realised that we had come very far indeed from primitive Connemara, for the first thing which met our eyes was a huge sign: "Beware of golf balls."